Welcome back, my friends. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. It is night in Washington, D.C., and the marble is cold under the moon. A tall stone man sits in silence, his hands heavy on the arms of his chair. Tourists stand below him and look up. Some speak in whispers. Some say nothing at all. The air feels still there, but not empty. It feels full of memory. You can almost hear old footsteps in the dark and the low sound of a nation asking one question again and again. How does a poor boy from a wooden cabin become one of the greatest presidents in history? My friends, let us step into the time machine now. Let us leave the white stone, the city lights, and the quiet cameras. Let us go back to a harder land, a rougher time, and a small child who had almost nothing. The story begins on February 12, 1809, in Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln was born in a one-room log cabin near Hodgenville. The floor was simple, the walls were rough. In winter, the wind could find its way through the wood. He was not born into power. He was not born into comfort. His family was poor, and life on the American frontier was never easy. His father, Thomas Lincoln, worked with his hands. He farmed. He built. He moved when land problems or money troubles pushed the family again. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, cared for the home and the children in a world where every day demanded work. There was no soft beginning for Abraham Lincoln. No fine school waited for him. No rich father planned his future. There was only land, labor, weather, hunger, and the long struggle to survive. And yet, even here, something was growing. Not fame, not power, something quieter. A kind of strength that does not shine at first. The strength to endure. The strength to watch, to listen, and to keep going when life gives very little back. When Abraham was still young, his family moved from Kentucky to Indiana. That trip was not a comfortable journey. It was a hard crossing through forests and mud, through cold air and uncertain roads. The family carried what they could. The rest they left behind. Imagine that small boy in the wagon, or walking beside it. The trees are tall and dark. The wheels sink into wet ground. The cold bites the skin. And ahead there is no promise, only more work. This was early America, my friends, and the frontier could be cruel. People built their homes with their own hands. They cut trees. They planted crops. They fought sickness, weather, and loneliness. One bad season could break a family, and what happened next would mark the boy for the rest of his life. In 1818, when Abraham was 9 years old, his mother died. The cause was likely milk sickness, a disease that took many lives on the frontier. One day she was there, a steady presence in the small home. Then she was gone. The cabin would have felt different after that. Quieter, colder, too large in some moments, too small in others. A child does not forget that kind of loss. But here's what many people never stop to consider. Greatness often begins in sorrow, not in glory. A child learns early that life is not fair. He learns that love can disappear. He learns that pain does not ask permission before it enters the room. Years later, people would see Abraham Lincoln as steady, calm, and strong. They would see the deep face, the serious eyes, and the careful words. But those things did not appear by magic. They were formed slowly, through grief, silence, and struggle. His father later married again, and Abraham's stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, became an important light in his life. She cared for him. She saw something in him. In a hard world, that kind of kindness can change a child. She encouraged his love of reading, and that love would become one of the great turning points in his story. Books were rare where he lived. School was limited. Lincoln probably had less than a year of formal schooling in total, spread across different times. He learned in pieces, not in a smooth path. He borrowed books when he could find them. He read by firelight. He read after work. He read when others rested. The room may have smelled of smoke and damp wood, and his hands may have been sore from labor, but he kept reading. Can you picture that scene? A rough cabin, a weak fire, a boy bent over a borrowed book, trying to pull a larger world into a small one. That image matters, my friends, because the future president was not built in a palace or a famous school. He was built in darkness and effort. He was built one page at a time. He read the Bible. He read Aesop's fables. He read stories of law, history, and public life. He read not to pass time, but to become more than his circumstances. And that is where this story begins to glow. Not with a crown, not with a title, with hunger. A hunger of the mind, a hunger to understand words, people, and the world. A hunger so strong that poverty could not kill it. Still, the road ahead would not open easily. Lincoln would work many jobs. He would fail. He would lose. He would carry sadness for much of his life, and the nation he would one day lead was moving toward a terrible storm. My friends, this is where the fire grows brighter and darker at the same time. Because while young Abraham learned to swing an axe, carry water, and read every book he could touch, the United States itself was also growing. New land opened. New states joined. New hopes rose. But one deep wound remained under everything: slavery. The same country that spoke of freedom still held millions of people in chains. The same nation that praised liberty still allowed human beings to be bought and sold. That contradiction stood there like a crack in a wall, and sooner or later the whole building would shake. Abraham Lincoln was still only a boy. He could not know then how close that storm would come to him. He could not know that one day he would stand at the center of it. He could not know that his name would become tied forever to union, freedom, and sacrifice. For now, he was only a poor child on the edge of the American frontier. But history was already watching. The world Abraham Lincoln entered was young, raw, and unfinished. America was not yet the giant power people know today. Much of the land felt rough and open, and many families lived close to hunger. In Indiana, where Lincoln spent much of his boyhood, daily life was physical in every sense. You woke with the sun. You cut wood. You planted crops. You fixed fences. Your clothes smelled of sweat, smoke, and earth. There was little extra time and little extra comfort. A broken tool mattered. A weak harvest mattered. A sick child mattered. Every small thing could become a large problem. Young Abraham grew tall and strong. He became known for hard work, especially with an axe. People later remembered him as a rail splitter, a man who could split logs into fence rails. It was hard work, and it shaped his body. But his mind kept reaching beyond the field. This contrast made him unusual. He could do the work of the frontier, and he did. Yet he also wanted language, ideas, and meaning. While others might end the day in sleep, he often turned toward a book. And here's what makes the image so powerful. Reading was not easy for him. Books were not waiting on a shelf. He had to borrow them. He had to protect them. He had to earn the right to hold them. One famous story tells of Lincoln borrowing a copy of Parson Weems's Life of George Washington. The book was damaged after getting wet, and Lincoln worked to repay the owner. Whether people tell that story with small changes or not, the point is clear. Books were precious to him. He respected learning because he had so little access to it. My friends, many people today think education only happens in a classroom. But Lincoln's early life tells us something else. Real learning can begin anywhere. In a cabin, by a fire, between hours of labor, in the tired mind of someone who refuses to stay small. As he grew older, Lincoln also became known for something else. He could tell stories. He could make people laugh. He could listen closely, then answer with a clear point or a clever image. This was not just natural charm. It was training. Listening to people, watching how words moved them, learning how to carry an idea into another person's mind. He worked different jobs as a young man. He farmed. He split rails. He worked as a store clerk. He served as a postmaster later. He surveyed land. None of these jobs looked grand. None of these jobs looked grand. None announced a great future. But each one taught him something. Work taught him about ordinary people. Poverty taught him about limits. Books taught him how to think. Conversation taught him how to speak, and then the wider world began to touch him more directly. In his youth, Lincoln traveled down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. Historians point to these trips as important moments because he likely saw slave markets there. Human beings were sold in public. Families could be divided by money and power. We should be careful not to invent his private thoughts in exact words. But it is reasonable to say such scenes could leave a deep mark on a serious mind. To see one human being treated as property is to see something broken at the center of society. The river itself must have been full of life and trade. Boats, mud, heat, voices in different accents, cotton, goods, noise, and somewhere in that busy movement stood the cold fact of slavery. The United States was growing fast, but not cleanly. Wealth moved. Land expanded, opportunity opened for some, suffering deepened for others. Lincoln returned to Illinois, where more of his adult life would take shape. Illinois was also a frontier place in many ways, full of growth and rough energy. It was there that the poor boy slowly became a young man with ambition, not the loud ambition of vanity, something steadier, a belief that he could rise by effort. He joined local life, he made friends, he built a reputation. People noticed his honesty, and the phrase "Honest Abe" grew from that reputation, though no man is perfect and legends always grow larger with time. Still, the core seems true. Lincoln wanted to be trusted. He took words seriously. He understood that character, once broken, is hard to repair, and what happened next would change the direction of his life. In 1832, he ran for the Illinois state legislature. He did not win that first race. He also served briefly in the Black Hawk War as a militia captain, though he saw no major battle. He returned with more public standing, but not with glory. Failure did not send him home in defeat. That matters. Many people think history is made by a few giant moments, but often it is made by smaller decisions no one notices at the time. A young man loses an election and keeps going. A poor worker keeps reading. A lonely boy becomes a speaker people remember. Lincoln studied law on his own. He was not shaped by a grand legal academy. He read law books, learned what he could, and eventually became a lawyer. In time, he rode the legal circuit in Illinois, traveling from town to town. Picture that world for a moment. Dirt roads, courthouses, saddlebags, boots covered in dust, long days of travel, rooms filled with farmers, merchants, arguments, and tired air. Here Lincoln sharpened one of his greatest tools, clear speech. He learned how to make a case step by step. He learned how to explain without confusing. He learned how to stand before others and carry both reason and feeling. These were not only lawyer skills, they were leader skills. My friends, before we continue, let us stay with one phrase from this part. By the 1830s and 1840s, Abraham Lincoln was building a life. He became a lawyer. He served in the Illinois legislature. He married Mary Todd in 1842. On the outside, his path seemed to be rising. But beneath that rise, both his private life and his country carried deep shadows. Lincoln knew sadness intimately. Friends and later accounts describe him as a man who could be deeply melancholy. Today, some people speak openly of depression when discussing him, though we should speak carefully across time. What is clear is this: sorrow stayed close to him. He laughed and told stories. Yes, he could brighten a room, but he also knew inward darkness. That kind of contrast is common in human life. The person who makes others smile may be carrying a heavy heart. The person who seems strong in public may be fighting quietly in private. Can you imagine Lincoln late at night after the voices are gone? A lamp burning low, papers on the table. Outside, the wind moving past the house. Inside, a man alone with his thoughts. He lost children too. This pain would mark him and Mary deeply. Their son Edward died in 1850, still a child. Later, during Lincoln's presidency, their son Willie would also die. But even before the White House years, grief had already entered the family. And while Lincoln struggled with private sorrow, the nation moved toward moral crisis. The central question was no longer hidden. Would slavery continue to spread across the country's western territories, or would it be stopped? This was not only a political argument, it was a battle over the meaning of the nation itself. Some Americans defended slavery as an economic system. Others defended it through racism and power. Still others wanted to avoid the issue entirely because it threatened comfort, trade, and political peace. But peace built on injustice never stays peaceful for long. Lincoln served one term in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849. He spoke against the Mexican-American War in ways that hurt his popularity with some people. After that term, he returned to Illinois in law, and for a time, his national career seemed limited. It would have been easy to stay there, to remain a lawyer, to earn a living, to avoid the largest conflict in the country. Many men did exactly that. But history has a way of pulling certain people forward when the old balance breaks. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shook Lincoln deeply. This law allowed settlers in those territories to decide the slavery question for themselves, and it effectively opened the door to slavery's expansion. It also weakened earlier attempts to limit where slavery could spread. To many, this was politics. To Lincoln, it became something larger. The old compromise was failing. The nation was no longer pushing the problem away. It was carrying it straight toward the center of its future. Lincoln re-entered politics with new force. He joined the emerging Republican Party, which opposed the spread of slavery into the territories. He spoke not as a man chasing a title, but as someone who felt that the country was drifting toward danger. His speeches grew stronger. His moral concern became clearer. Yet Lincoln was also a politician of his time, shaped by the language and limits of that era. We do not honor history by making it simpler than it was. He was a man moving through a broken system, growing in public clarity as the crisis sharpened. And then came one of the great rivalries in American political history. Stephen A. Douglas was one of the most powerful political figures of the day. He was skilled, sharp, and famous. In 1858, Lincoln challenged him in the Illinois Senate race, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates drew national attention. These debates were not small local events. They were public tests of ideas. Crowds gathered. Dust rose. Men stood on wooden platforms and argued over the future of slavery, democracy, and the Union. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers should decide the slavery issue in each territory. Lincoln argued that the nation could not remain forever divided between slavery and freedom. One line from Lincoln's campaign became especially famous: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He did not mean the Union would immediately collapse, but he warned that the country could not remain permanently half slave and half free. That phrase landed like a hammer. Lincoln lost the Senate race. Douglas won, and yet Lincoln's words traveled farther than defeat. Newspapers spread them. Political leaders noticed. The tall lawyer from Illinois was no longer a local figure. But here is what most people never hear in the simple version of success. Sometimes you lose the race that introduces you to the world. Defeat can become a doorway. Public failure can become preparation. Still, the country itself was moving towards something terrible. Violence over slavery had already appeared in places like Kansas. Fear and anger were rising. Trust between North and South was breaking. The language of compromise was becoming weak and tired. You could almost feel it in the air of the late 1850s. Train smoke, newspaper ink, angry speeches, crowded halls, men shaking hands in public and planning separation in private. My friends, this part of the story is not only about Abraham Lincoln. It is also about what happens when people keep delaying a truth they do not want to face. Many of us do this in our own lives. We stay in the job, the habit, the silence, because change feels dangerous. But hidden problems grow in the dark, and when we wait too long, the cost becomes much higher. By 1860, the United States had become obsessed with its own future. Every speech, every newspaper, every election seemed to turn around the same burning issue. Would the nation stay together? And if it did, what kind of nation would it be? Lincoln entered the presidential race at exactly this charged moment. He was not the most famous candidate at first. He did not come with the polished shine of old political dynasties. But he had something powerful: moral seriousness, political skill, and the image of a self-made man. His Cooper Union speech in New York in early 1860 helped him greatly. He appeared thoughtful, calm, and informed. He showed that he was not just a frontier storyteller or a regional politician. He was a national figure. The room would have been full of attention. Coats, lamps, breath held in silence before applause. Lincoln's voice was not elegant in the fancy sense, but it carried weight because people believed he meant what he said. That matters more than style. At the Republican convention in Chicago, Lincoln gained support and won the nomination. He was a Western candidate with broad appeal in a divided party. When the general election came, he won the presidency in November 1860. But his victory did not bring celebration everywhere. For many in the South, Lincoln's election felt like a direct threat. Even though he had not called for immediate abolition where slavery already existed, his opposition to its expansion convinced many Southern leaders that their power was in danger. And then the country began to break apart. Before Lincoln even took office, several Southern states seceded from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. This was not an argument in a hall anymore. It was disunion in real time. Imagine Lincoln traveling to Washington as president-elect. The journey carried tension and even threats. The capital itself was uneasy. Rumors moved quickly. Fear moved faster. He arrived not to lead a stable nation, but to hold together one already cracking. My friends, this is where the story becomes almost unbearable in its pressure. Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union. He also believed slavery was wrong, but he faced a political and military reality full of traps. Move too slowly and injustice grows. Move too fast and border states may leave. Speak too softly and the crisis deepens. Speak too boldly and the fire may spread. Leadership is often lonely because every path carries pain. When Lincoln gave his first inaugural address in March 1861, he tried to calm the crisis. He spoke against secession and argued that the Union was permanent. He appealed to reason and shared memory. He ended with a hope for peace, but words alone could not stop what was coming. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. The sound of cannon fire at the harbor did more than begin a battle. It marked the end of one America and the beginning of another. Men who had once called each other countrymen now marched under different flags. Lincoln responded by calling for troops. More states then seceded. The war widened. He was now president in the worst possible hour. The White House was no calm palace. It became a working center of emergency. Messages arrived. Casualty lists came in. Generals disappointed him. Politicians pressured him. Mothers waited for news. The nation bled. And still Lincoln kept working. One of his great strengths was growth. He was not a perfect war leader on day one. He learned. He adjusted. He replaced generals. He listened, but he also decided. He carried criticism from all sides and kept moving. That is a rare kind of resilience, my friends. Not the loud strength of a man who never doubts. The quieter strength of a man who doubts, suffers, and still acts. His face changed during those years. Photographs show it clearly. The lines deepened. The eyes sank further. The beard, the tired mouth, the long, worn look of him, all of it tells a story of burden. And yet, even in war, his language could rise to unusual beauty. He wrote not with empty decoration, but with moral force. He could take a giant national struggle and place it in plain, powerful words. This gift would matter more and more as the war continued, because the Civil War was not only a military conflict, it was becoming a moral reckoning. At first, Lincoln's central public goal was preserving the Union. But as the war went on, slavery moved closer to the center of wartime policy. Enslaved people fled to Union lines. Abolitionists pressed harder. The logic of war and the logic of justice began to meet, and what happened next would change not only Lincoln's presidency, but the meaning of the war itself. My friends, before we continue, let us stay with one phrase from this part. By 1862, the Civil War had become longer, bloodier, and more painful than many had imagined. Early dreams of a quick end were gone. The war dragged through mud, smoke, hunger, and death. Reports from the front came with names of battles and numbers of losses. Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Each name carried fields of suffering. Boots in the mud, torn flags, hospital tents smelling of blood and medicine, letters folded in shaking hands. Lincoln read those reports. He met with generals. He visited soldiers. He also visited hospitals where the human cost of leadership stood right before him. Can you imagine walking through such rooms? Rows of wounded men, low voices, bandages, the sound of pain held back because others were hurting too. A president cannot see that and remain untouched. At home, Mary Lincoln also suffered greatly, and the White House itself became a house of grief when their son Willie died in 1862. He was only 11 years old. The loss devastated them. So think of Lincoln in this terrible year, a nation at war, a son dead, political enemies attacking him, military results mixed and often disappointing. It was enough to crush many people. But here is where his story reaches one of its highest points. Lincoln had long believed slavery was wrong. Now he saw more clearly that the war and slavery could not be separated. If the Union was to be saved in a deeper sense, slavery had to be struck. After the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, which gave the Union enough of a military opening, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It announced that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be declared free on January 1, 1863. This did not end slavery everywhere at once. It did not free all enslaved people immediately. History is often slower and more complex than our symbols. But the proclamation changed the character of the war. Now the Union cause stood publicly tied to freedom as well as union. That shift mattered enormously. It discouraged European powers from openly supporting the Confederacy. It gave moral force to the Union war effort. It opened the door for black men to serve in the Union Army, and nearly 180,000 would do so by war's end. The struggle had become larger and clearer. Some criticized Lincoln for moving too far. Others attacked him for moving too slowly. That was the burden of his position. In a divided country, even moral progress arrives through conflict. Still, he moved. My friends, resilience is not only the ability to survive pain. Sometimes it is the courage to act morally while pain is still happening. Then came July 1863. The Union victory at Gettysburg marked a turning point in the war, though the conflict would continue with terrible cost. In November of that year, Lincoln went to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the dead. He delivered one of the shortest and most famous speeches in American history. We do not need to quote it at length to feel its force. In just a few words, Lincoln lifted the war from politics into principle. He spoke of equality, sacrifice, and the unfinished work of democracy. The ground there had been soaked with blood. Graves lay under fresh earth. The air would have carried the chill of late autumn. And Lincoln, standing before mourning families and public leaders, reminded the nation that the dead must not have died in vain. That speech still lives because it is clear, humble, and morally direct. It does not shout. It does not boast. It points. This is what great language does, my friends. It does not always use big words. It says the deepest thing in the cleanest way. Yet even after Gettysburg, the war was not over. More death would come. More doubt would come. In 1864, Lincoln faced re-election while the war continued. Had the Union failed enough that voters would remove him? It was a real possibility. Then military success improved, especially with Union gains under Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Lincoln won re-election in November 1864. The public chose continuity in the middle of war. That victory gave him the power to press toward another great goal, the complete legal destruction of slavery. He supported the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery in the United States. Congress passed it in January 1865, and the amendment was later ratified by the states that year. Think of the distance traveled. A poor boy on the frontier grows into the president who leads the nation through civil war and helps destroy slavery by law. It sounds almost too large to believe, but it happened through years of effort, grief, thought, and endurance. Still, history does not offer clean endings. The war continued into 1865. Casualties mounted. Cities and farms suffered. Freedom came, but pain remained. The nation was moving toward victory, yet it was also full of wounds that would not heal quickly. My friends, this hard chapter asks something from us. Many of us want change without cost. We want better lives, but we want comfort at the same time. Lincoln's story reminds us that the most important changes often demand patience, pressure, and brave action in the middle of fear. We do not shame ourselves for being tired, but we must not expect great things from a life built only on ease. In the final months of the war, Abraham Lincoln became both stronger and gentler in public tone. That may sound strange, but true resilience often works that way. A person passes through fire and comes out with more steel, but also more mercy. By 1865, Union victory was drawing near. General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army was weakening. The Confederacy itself was running out of strength. The end could be seen, though not yet touched. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, showed the depth of his moral vision. He did not speak as a man celebrating the defeat of enemies. He spoke as a leader, trying to understand national suffering through humility and responsibility. His words suggested that slavery had stained the whole nation, and that war itself might be a terrible judgment on that long injustice. This was not the voice of revenge. It was the voice of a man asking how a broken people might rebuild without hatred destroying them completely. The day was wet and gray, according to some accounts. Mud underfoot. Crowds gathered. A tired president stood before them with a face lined by war. And instead of pride, he offered seriousness. That is rare in politics. It was rare then, and it is rare now. He wanted reunion, but not denial. He wanted peace, but not forgetfulness. He wanted the South back in the Union, but not on the old terms of slavery and rebellion. And yet, the long transformation ahead would be difficult. Freedom in law does not become equality in life overnight. Millions of formerly enslaved people were stepping into legal freedom while facing enormous danger, poverty, and resistance. The nation had changed, but the hearts of many had not. This is one of history's hardest truths. A law can open a door, but it cannot force every person to walk through with justice in their hands. Still, the transformation was real. The 13th Amendment destroyed slavery as a legal institution across the United States. Black soldiers had fought bravely for the Union and for freedom. The meaning of citizenship and democracy had begun to shift. Lincoln did not complete that work alone, and he should not be described as if he did. Enslaved people resisted slavery. Abolitionists fought for years. Soldiers died. Activists spoke. Many forces moved history. But Lincoln stood at the center of the political transformation that made national abolition possible. That is his place in the story. And now we come to one of the saddest turns of all. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was effectively ending. The Union had survived. Slavery had been struck down. The long nightmare seemed finally to be lifting. Washington must have felt different in those days. Bells. Relief. Flags. Crowds speaking with exhausted joy. People breathing again after years of fear. Lincoln himself seemed to hold hope for a healing future. He spoke of Reconstruction, the work of bringing the states back and shaping freedom after war. It would be hard, but there was a path. Then on April 14, 1865, he went to Ford's Theater with Mary. He was there to watch a play. For a few hours, perhaps, the war leader could rest. The theater would have been warm with gaslight. People sat in their seats. There was laughter, movement, ordinary evening life. Then actor John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln. The moment shattered the room and the nation. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house where doctors and officials gathered. Through the night, he lay dying. On the morning of April 15, he died. The timing made the shock even greater. He was killed just as the war was ending. Just when victory had come. Just when the next chapter might begin under his hand. My friends, history can be unbearably cruel in this way. A man survives 4 years of civil war and falls in a theater chair days after peace appears. The country mourned deeply. Trains carried his body across cities and towns. Crowds gathered in black clothing. Faces blurred with tears. He had become more than a president. He had become a symbol of sacrifice, union, and unfinished hope. And what happened next would shape America for generations. Because Lincoln's death left Reconstruction in other hands. That matters. The nation did end slavery, but it did not move into justice smoothly. The years after the war brought progress, but also backlash, violence, and broken promises. Lincoln's absence became part of that tragedy, even if no one can say exactly how every event would have changed had he lived. What we can say is simpler and strong enough. He helped save the Union. He helped end slavery and law. He carried immense sorrow without surrendering to despair. He turned personal hardship into public purpose. Today, Abraham Lincoln lives in the world in many ways at once. He lives in stone, in schools, in books, in speeches children memorize, and in the quiet face on the $5 bill. He lives in the Lincoln Memorial, where visitors climb wide steps and look up at a seated figure larger than life. He lives in photographs, with his lined cheeks and deep-set eyes. He lives in arguments, too, because great figures are never kept only in praise. That is part of being real. Modern Americans remember Lincoln for many reasons. Some remember the poor boy who educated himself. Some remember the president who held the Union together. Some remember the leader tied forever to emancipation. Some study his limits, his politics, and the long struggle that freedom still required after his death. All of those views stand in the same room, and maybe that is right. To honor history is not to flatten it. It is to keep asking honest questions while still seeing greatness where it truly existed. If you visit places connected to Lincoln, the story becomes physical again. In Kentucky, there is the memory of the cabin world where he began. In Springfield, Illinois, you can feel the path of the lawyer and politician. In Washington, you feel the weight of war in memory, the smell of old wood in preserved homes, the smooth stone of memorial walls, the soft shuffle of visitors in museum halls. These details remind us that history is not only dates, it is the trace of real life left in material things. But Lincoln also lives in present-day struggles over democracy, equality, and national identity. His story returns every time Americans ask who belongs in the promise of the country. It returns when people argue over race, citizenship, and freedom. It returns when leaders face division and must choose between popularity and principle. That is why he remains important. Not because he solved everything. He did not. Not because the nation he helped save became just overnight. It did not. He matters because he faced the deepest contradiction in American life and moved the nation through a transforming crisis. And he did it while carrying more than most people could bear. My friends, think of the image we began with. A stone figure in the night, silent above the city. Why do people still come there? Why do they still stand under those tall columns and look up? Because somewhere inside, many of us still hunger for proof that character matters. That humble beginnings do not block great purpose. That language, used carefully, can heal. That moral courage is possible even in broken times. Lincoln offers no easy comfort. His life was full of loss. His era was violent. His nation was divided. His work remained unfinished. Yet that is exactly why his story still speaks. It speaks to the student with little money. It speaks to the worker who feels unseen. It speaks to the person who failed once and thinks the door is closed. It speaks to anyone carrying private sadness while trying to serve something larger than themselves. And here is one concrete image that connects his world to yours. Perhaps tonight you sit in a small room with a phone in your hand, trying to learn English after a long day. Maybe the light is dim. Maybe your body is tired. Maybe progress feels slow. Now remember another learner in another hard room. A boy with a borrowed book. Firelight on the page, work waiting in the morning. No guarantee of success. Still reading. That line from him to you is not fantasy. It is the thresh of resilience. The tools changed. The human struggle did not. In Lincoln's time, the obstacle was distance, poverty, and a lack of books. In your time, the obstacle may be distraction, fear, and self-doubt. But the answer still begins the same way. Return to the work. Return to the page. Return to the voice. This is where history becomes useful, my friends. Not when it sits frozen in marble, but when it walks back into our daily life and says, begin again. Abraham Lincoln's life teaches a simple lesson, but not an easy one. You do not need a perfect beginning to build a meaningful life. That sounds gentle, but it is also demanding. Because once you accept it, many excuses lose their power. Lincoln did not wait for ideal conditions. He did not come from wealth. He did not move through life without pain. He learned in fragments. He failed in public. He buried people he loved. He led through hatred and war, and still he continued. My friends, resilience is often misunderstood. People think it means never feeling weak, never crying, never losing heart. But that is not resilience. Resilience is carrying sorrow without letting sorrow choose your direction. Lincoln shows us that strength can look tired. It can have lines in its face. It can speak slowly. It can sit alone in a room and still rise for the next day's burden. There is great comfort in that truth. Maybe you are not fighting a civil war. Of course not. But perhaps you are fighting smaller battles every day. Fear of speaking. Shame about mistakes. A tired mind after work. The old voice inside that says, people like me do not become fluent. People like me do not change. That voice is lying to you. Lincoln's life is not a magic promise that everyone becomes president. That is not the lesson. The lesson is that disciplined effort can carry a human being far beyond the place where they began. He built himself slowly, by reading when books were rare, by speaking carefully, by thinking deeply, by returning after defeat, by growing under pressure instead of breaking under it. That is a pattern any learner can respect. And here is another part of the lesson. Greatness is not only personal success. Lincoln's life mattered because his growth became service. He did not rise only to admire himself. He rose to carry responsibility. That is a higher form of ambition. So when you study English, do not study only for image. Do not study only to impress. Study so your mind opens wider. Study so your voice becomes useful. Study so you can help, lead, explain, comfort, and stand in difficult moments with clearer words. Language can be power. But better than that, language can be service. Tonight, before you sleep, choose one sentence from this story that stayed with you. Say it out loud 3 times. Slowly, feel each word in your mouth. Then speak one new sentence about your own life using the phrase, keep going, or hold together. This is how English grows. Through your voice tonight in a real room. And now the fire burns lower. The poor boy in the cabin is gone. The war leader is gone. The tired face in the photographs belongs to another century. But the example remains. And perhaps that is enough. A person can begin in darkness and still become a light for others. A person can lose deeply and still serve greatly. A person can be wounded and still refuse to surrender what is right. Remember that, my friends, when your own road feels small or hard. Some of the strongest lives begin quietly. Some of the greatest changes begin with one page, one honest effort, one more day of work. So, sit with that thought a moment longer. Not the marble statue, not the famous name. The boy with the book.